This video was produced by
I was ABD at UNC and for various reasons ended up moving to Charlottesville. And as I was getting ready to go, a couple of people in the department said basically the following thing to me, which is that, well, you could go meet people at the UVA department, but in general, UVA tends to be kind of snooty. So don't expect to be welcomed with open arms necessarily. And so I eventually, after a week or so there, not knowing anybody in town, I wanted to go, and there were a couple of people I really wanted to meet. I really wanted to meet Cargile, and I also really wanted to meet Humphreys, mostly Cargile. And so I went to, walk down the hall. There's nobody there, and I knocked on the door to Cargile's office, and I hear this thump. And Jim opens the door, and I'm like, hello, Professor Cargile, such and such, and this is why I'm here. And I thought I would talk about philosophy. And he says, I have to finish doing my chin-ups. I went down the door in the corner, and I look around the corner, and he's got a bar embedded in the corner of his office, concrete, I think. And he's still doing chin-ups, and he drops down and swings back around, and he says, come on over, and sits down at his desk and says, have some cookies. And he opens up a Tupperware full of homemade cookies, and we start talking about philosophy of logic, and I thought, it's not snooty at all. And I was always made to feel really at home there. And I just wanted to say one more thing before I get to the substantive stuff. I did spend a lot of time over at the UVA department, and spent a lot of time with the graduate students. And graduate students love stories of professorial eccentricity. And as it turns out, Jim is the source of some of these, one or two of these stories. And one of the stories was that he had, at some point in the past, published an Alan Sokal style send-up of analytic philosophy under the name I Am Picayune, and actually published it in Analysis. And I remember saying, I believe a lot of things about Jim, and that's not completely out of the question, but I just can't believe that. And I had actually was interested enough that I tried to look it up a couple of times. I think I misspelled Picayune. At any rate, Jim's our visiting scholar. Which means he gave a talk last night as well. We went out for beers afterwards. Let me just say the reliable source has confirmed that this story is in fact true. So at any rate, let me tell you the more substantial stuff. Jim got his BA from the University of Utah. He took his MA at UVA and got his PhD at Cambridge. He has taught at the University of Michigan, University of Illinois, the FBI Academy, and for some time at UVA, currently at UVA. He's the author of Paradoxes, a study in form and predication, and also a very large number of, in my opinion, very interesting papers. I think he writes on very interesting topics: fatalism, skepticism, logical form, classical logic. He's got a paper I'm very fond of, classical logic, the logic contemporary and modern, and he's published in some of the, maybe all of the top journals in the field, including News, the Journal of Philosophy, Field Review, Analysis, Mind, and leaving some out. At any rate, without further ado, we're very happy to have him here, Jim Cargile. Speaking on philosophy of logic.
Well, thank you, Bill. That just shows the value of courtesy. If I had failed, then he might have gotten even today. But I'm very grateful to have been invited to speak here, and I very much appreciate Tracy and Tom's work making this conference, which is really quite a fine conference. My title, Philosophy of Logic, is somewhat half-baked, though there are some foods that are fine that way. I was supposed to speak on philosophy of logic, and I never got a more specific title in, so I thought that sounded good enough. That's really why I've got it. But trying to rationalize a bit, I wanted to explain why I don't like philosophy of logic. And I prefer logic, and I don't particularly like philosophical logic, But I notice anyway that we do have philosophical logic, but nobody goes for logical philosophy. I mean, I think the implications there would be insulting, to people who are doing the other kind. But anyway, I won't go on about this philosophy of kind of thing. I think I'm going to skip that. But the idea of logic in modern academic life can refer to a formal discipline that breaks up into all sorts of subfields. So people can be specialists in propositional logic, of all kinds of propositional logic, and predicate logic, and free logic, and hybrid logic, and so on. And this is very fine, and it's thinking of logic, I think, as a computational device for recognizing certain relations. One of the commonest is necessary connection, impossibility of premises true, conclusion false. But this is not very popular with some leading American logicians such as Quine. They didn't like the idea of possibility. Maybe it's the American pragmatist spirit. Everything is possible, which made that unsuitable. So they would try to explain in other terms, such as logical consequence, all interpretations that make the premises true, make the conclusion true. But at any rate, they were investigating a certain kind of relation. And there's also a provability relation, a derivability relation, which doesn't have any necessary connection with the interpretation, the semantics, and the like, which can be studied really formally. And I admire this formal logic very much, very much. And I do teach it. And I've never produced anything in mathematical logic, but I think it's quite wonderful. And I always teach it as mathematics. And I say there is, with some of it, the question of how you translate arguments in English. I always say I want nothing to do with that, nothing to do with that. And there I'm very, dissatisfied with the idea of the formal logic as a guide to our thinking. And in this, I'm a religious Platonist, and Plato came in at a crucial time in technology when writing was being introduced. And his hero Socrates didn't write, and the great Greek poets didn't use writing. They may have cheated, but they did everything in their memory. And what people said would vanish in the air. The only thing that held it was memory. It was the only way it would persist. And they celebrated it tremendously. In Plato's Parmenides, strangers come to town. They want to hear about this wonderful encounter between the young Socrates and the old Parmenides and the middle-aged Zeno. And they say, all right, we know someone who was there. And they go, and he recites the whole thing. That's the pretense. And the idea is that getting it this way is the right way to get it. So Plato, of course, is a very ambivalent, profoundly ambivalent philosopher because he's writing, but he's always expressing this distrust of writing. And the idea of form in Plato is radically different from what you find in Aristotle, and this is because Aristotle comes in at the time of writing. It came in very slowly. When the Greeks were writing at first, all they did was write sounds. I mean, they wrote symbols for sounds. It was like writing music. So the first, their way of approaching writing, there are other, ideographic languages and like, but their approach to language, writing, was to reproduce the sounds of speech and to write cues for that. Like writing music, I think, like writing music. But writing gradually took over. And when people thought about form, they began to think about sentence form. And Aristotle's a good example of this. And last year in Cambridge, I offended a group of linguists by saying that logical form should be Platonic form. And this was, to say the least, extremely unpopular. I mean, the idea is that, no, we're talking about sentence form when we talk about form. And I say philosophy of logic is involved in this and has a strong prejudice in favor of the conception of logic as a subject that was developed as form of written things by Aristotle. So I'm going to start with a quote from an excellent elementary logic book by a disciple of Tarski, Benson Mates. Mates says, "We can flatly say that the history of logic begins with the Greek philosopher Aristotle." Aristotle, according to all available evidence, created the science of logic absolutely ex nihilo. As a Platonist, I say, this I find is really annoying. Now, to find another quotation, I cited Wittgenstein. Of course, he wouldn't like being cited as a Platonist. But anyway, in the remarks on the foundation of mathematics, he says this: mathematical logic has completely deformed the thinking of mathematicians and of philosophers by setting up a superficial interpretation of the forms of our everyday language as an analysis of the structures of facts. Of course, in this, it has only continued to build on the Aristotelian logic. Yes. At any rate, sometimes logic is used, I think naturally in natural language, as an evaluative term just meaning good reasoning. We just say that's logical, that's logic, we're saying that's good reasoning. And if we thought of philosophy of logic that way, we'd be thinking of philosophy of reasoning, which I think is a suspicious topic. But good reasoning is very important. It has great authority. It's a wonderful thing. But we have trouble recognizing it. So we have a great deal of trouble recognizing what is good reasoning. I think Aristotle was a foundationalist, and I was thinking of saying to you that I'm an anti-foundationalist, but then it occurred to me that it's more important that you wouldn't know what I was saying. And I believe, you see, Plato says philosophy is dialogue. If you haven't talked together enough on certain things, then you aren't able to triangulate and actually know what you're talking about. And that's something I'm particularly concerned about. But at any rate, the idea of logic as reasoning is important because I think then a good reasoning, that should be distinguished from formal general rules which will enable us to spot good reasoning. So that in Aristotle's syllogism, I believe, not only the idea of forms which are the right ways to reason, but also they are the right ways when you organize the premises, you get the premises from other syllogisms, you eventually get back to proper foundations. And Aristotle is definitely a foundationalist. You're looking for scientia, scientific knowledge, and syllogism is a key way of building this structure. And the syllogisms are written. I think it's very important that they are written. And if you look at the syllogistic forms from another perspective, a Platonic perspective, I think you get a very different idea. And you can't tell the difference between Darii and Datisi and so on. I mean, depending on whether you've got some S or M or some M or S, the difference in the forms, because it's based on the written sentences. Well, I want to say that we should be concerned with propositions in evaluating good reasoning. This issue might seem to be taken up by Quine and Putnam in their two books on philosophy of logic. Quine says, philosophers who favor propositions have said that propositions are needed because truth only of propositions, not of sentences, is intelligible. An unsympathetic answer is that we can explain truth of sentences to the propositionalist in his own terms. Sentences are true whose meanings are true propositions. Any failure of intelligibility here is already his own fault. And Quine goes on to call the proposition view shabby, an imaginary projection from sentences. Now, his disciple, Hilary Putnam, and typically, if a disciple wants to act like a rebel, in his philosophy of logic book says, true makes no sense when applied to a physical object, even if that physical object be an inscription of a sentence. It's not the physical sentence that's true or false, but what the sentence says. That sounds really inspired. And the things sentences say, unlike the sentences themselves, are not physical objects. Well, that's very fine. That's very fine. But I say his words imply, and his practice does too, it seems to me, that given a sentence token, there's some non-physical object that is what the sentence says. Now, if there really is a one-to-one correspondence here, an easy formula, then I think Quine's position is the right one. Identifying a sentence is incomparably easier than determining what, if anything, it says. Quine himself says, that it's not really sentences we're talking about, but events of utterance. He wants to be specific. I don't think this addresses the problem. But if it did, if we could speak of the proposition expressed by S in the event of utterance U, then, as Quine says, the propositions would be idle baggage. Furthermore, the sentences would be available to us for computational moves in formal logic, which is very valuable. But I think that Quine has failed to understand exactly the nature of what is said and its relation to logical reasoning. Now, when we talk about forms, as I say, one account is in terms of sentence forms. And sentence forms make sense best in terms of a derivability from a restricted blank form. So you can have a blank, and every sentence is of that form. But you can have restrictions on the things that are eligible to go in the blanks. And this is a very checkable notion. And you notice that sometimes this doesn't have anything to do with logic or linguistics. You can say, sentence answering the question whether the liquid in vat A is acid. And you'd need some litmus paper or whatever, to do this. And the sentence wouldn't have any particular form. It would fit that blank form by virtue of answering the question, correctly, what the stuff in vat A is. But what we find among logicians is the practice. You could also have, say, a blank form, sentence answering whether Goldbach conjecture is provable, and things like that. But logicians, when they deny, say, that the King of France is wise, is of the subject-predicate form. In other words, it's of the form subject-predicate. They don't feel constrained by the idea of derivability from a blank form and exhibiting substitution. They don't do that at all. And you see, in English, the King of France is wise is of the form subject-predicate. This is really quite trivial. And you see in the discussion of definite descriptions, people who are quite casual about this, even champions of ordinary language like Strawson. He takes up Russell's view that the King of France is wise isn't subject-predicate, and that it's really like there is exactly one King of France. And I wanted to say, excuse me, sir, I've had an opportunity to speak to that great man. He really is an admirable hero, but at any rate, there is exactly one King of France is subject-predicate. I mean, what can we mean? When you say, the King of France is wise, of course, is subject-predicate, but then we have this one that isn't, I say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. And what you're trying to do is identify some sort of logical function in terms of assuming that it's tied to some piece of language. And I always say that this is rather like the man, who is lost in New York City. He's trying to get a cab to help him. He says he's at the intersection of walk and don't walk. But the forms of language are not reliably connected with logical functions, natural language. I mean, this is an essential feature of natural language. Now, definable languages of mathematical logic, have the feature that, I'm sorry, I'm really tempted to drink out of the pitcher, but, oh, thanks. They have the feature that they are defined by their association with logical functions, and then great things can be done. But when I see Russell saying, I'm concerned with the analysis of the F is G, and he's going to give you the analysis, but then he says, of course, we mean the King of France is wise. We don't mean the whale is a mammal, because that's not of the form the F is G. I want to say, what? I mean, the whale is a mammal, and the King of France is wise are both of the form the F is G by a reasonable, simple linguistic standard. But what he has in mind is that there's something going on with the one that isn't going on with the other. I agree with that, but this should properly be described by reference to the Platonic form. And if this had been done, I think a lot of trouble could have been saved in discussions of definite descriptions. And now we have much more complicated things, plural descriptions, VFs, which got a lot of interest because people thought that perhaps this would be an escape from set theory, and somehow we could get away from all the restrictions that people have in set theory in order to avoid contradictions. But at any rate, the same trouble's there. You don't have identification in terms of a real, that is, Platonic form or function. You just assume that you're talking about something that is tied to a piece of language, and I think that is an objectionable presupposition. So I'm skipping things here because I see that I'm not making such good time. In many formal systems, it's possible to describe every possible valid form of argument in the system in the sense that there are a finite number of axiom forms and rules of inference, and every valid argument is a finite list of entries in the specified forms. The notion of validity here does not make reference to logical possibility or truth or falsity. So one notion of logical validity is impossible to have premises true, conclusion false. That's modal validity. And modal validity is mixed up with the imagination. If you want to find out about possibility, I think all we've got is the imagination. People will often point out that it's quite wretched. I say yes, but that doesn't prove we've got anything else. But you have this idea of modal connection, impossible to have premises true, conclusion false, and you can avoid that and instead talk about this provability relation. I think that's already present in Aristotle's syllogistic. So Aristotle wasn't, he certainly didn't have a modern conception of necessity, but you could say, looking at the syllogisms, you pick the right ones, say, as what the best people do in the way of reasoning, and you'd say it's impossible for the premises to be true and conclusion false. What's that mean? It means that it's an instance of this kind of syllogism. In other words, you would be using the authority of the syllogism and the forms to explain the necessary connection rather than appealing to intuitions about necessary connection. But those are two different kinds of validity. What I'm concerned with, though, is Platonic validity, which is resistant to finite summary, because the idea of a valid form is just a good one, and good is not definable. For Aristotle, the first thing he starts with is contempt for Plato's form of the good, and in order to introduce objectivity back into ethics, he has to talk about goodness in terms of lawfulness and obedience to law. And the idea then is dealing with legal relativity, the impossibility of determining, what the real proper system of laws and so on is. But anyway, I have a very pessimistic view then about Platonic validity as simply value or goodness in an argument. I wanted to say that I think this applies to the notorious problem of induction, or the justification of induction. Induction can mean various things. Here's one. I'm not saying this is what induction is, but it will do. It's reasoning about what's going to happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. It's easy to give examples called induction that don't fit that, but that's not the point. People are worried about justifying this. People really are worried. They're saying, how do we justify, reasoning and conclusions about the future based on the past? I think this is absurd, since many conclusions about the future are idiotic. There's no reason to be worried about justifying them. On the other hand, some of them are justified, but then you're not really asking how we justify those that are justified, unless maybe what you really want is a formula for determining this. In other words, what you want is to be able to calculate to find out whether they're justified. That's a different matter. And I believe that these things get confused. So that the easy recognizability of a structure, for example, in an Aristotelian syllogism, gets confused with a ticket for being able to determine easily whether or not we know something, which I think is a will-o'-the-wisp. Well, I talked about the nature of propositions. I'm going to skip that. But I think that it's very bad that we have so many abstruse theories about propositions when, as Putnam was saying, they are just what is said. And I say that if you don't really have an idea about what is said, if you don't recognize that as a general kind, then there's not much use talking to you. I mean, you may or may not have encountered what is said on some occasion. If you haven't, then we have problems. And if you have, that's what a proposition is. There shouldn't be any abstruse theory. So someone informs you that your car is not worth repairing. Bad news. I've had this experience. But anyway, you go in and they say your car is not worth repairing. Now, you could play the skeptic. He may be trying to cheat you. You say, I don't know what you're saying. What are you saying? And he could go into this and say the car's not operational, the cost of getting it usable is more than the cost of cars matching or excelling yours, etc. But at any rate, it seems to me that if you latch onto the forms of these sentences, I mean, you're just chasing shadows. They change all the time. There is the bad news, your car is beyond repair. And this can be put in Chinese or whatever language, and sign language and the like. And the question about its logical form is inappropriate. Unless you're talking about the Platonic form. There are Platonic forms here. I mean, he is doing this. He is delivering bad news about your vehicle. And this is something that doesn't have to be expressed linguistically. Anyway, once people have succeeded at asserting, formulating, or expressing a proposition, then a single sentence token may be used as a mnemonic for what was so put forward. And many alternative sentences of different grammatical forms would do just as well. Taking such a sentence to itself assert the thing invites confusion. And just having the thing be an abstract entity or whatever is not answering the problem. A sentence doesn't assert anything. Plato makes jokes about that. It would surely equally well express the thing. We have the idea that in disjunctive syllogism, either P or Q, not Q, therefore P, that in the first place, it expresses the proposition, and in the conclusion, it asserts it. I say, what do you mean? People do this. And that sentence, the idea that it's doing either of those, I think, is somewhat nonsensical. I had a good argument for this here, but I can't find it right now, and we'll skip it. At any rate, so I had some comments to make about contradictory sentences as opposed to contradictions in themselves. And it's always a contingent fact that a sentence expresses a contradiction. Always a contingent fact. When parties to a dialogue manage to grasp a proposition, whether they accept it or not, it's not that there is a sentence that makes them same-sayers. This was a problem for Quine, and Davidson took this up. The idea of two sentences expressing the same proposition, and this gave Quine ontological problems. But at any rate, it's not the case that when people agree on something, there's a sentence that makes them same-sayers. What makes them same-sayers is success in dialogue, coming to understand each other, knowing what they're talking about. Now, I have to admit that oracles can convey thoughts without offering any clarification. And we also might decode messages from outer space. And we really have to pay good attention to this, and hermeneutics is an important activity, people trying to make out something. When you can't talk with the people, Plato always complains about that. You've got a sentence, and the person who wrote it isn't there. See, that's a complaint about writing. Nonetheless, the possibility of being confronted with requests for clarification and satisfying them is the basis for our understanding of what is said. If we wonder what someone is getting at in saying actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, the sentence, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, expresses the proposition that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, is a non-starter. This is something involved in Tarski's theory of truth, incidentally, getting away from the annoying indirect quotation, finding a formula to finally get it back to sentences. And they're ready to do a rewording, because sometimes rewording is needed, and qualifying it to true in English is no improvement. Rewording by some formula of recursive syntax is no good, because there is no recursive syntax for language, natural language. Now, recursive syntax is great for mathematical logic. That's the difference. And of course, you get examples of recursive syntax in English. It's not the case that P is not the case that is not the case that is. I mean, in other words, you can take all these kind of things and iterate, and people are supposed to recognize that this will go on ad infinitum, and they make a great deal of this productivity as an important feature of language. I don't think it's particularly important myself. And at any rate, general efforts to give recursive syntax for English in a way that's even remotely comparable to the recursive syntax for mathematical logic have been complete failures. And relativization to ordered triples of sentences, times, and persons, that's Donald Davidson, is no better. Knowing that it was John Stuart Mill and the exact date and words equally misses the point. That's the triple, What is missing is talking with him. And that's for Plato's heaven. So we have the possibility in formal logic of tying formal expressions to logical functions. But the ideal of transferring this to English, I think, is quite confused. Now, I'm not denying that English can be used to achieve truth functional compounding or quantifying, existential quantifiers, universal quantifiers, branching quantifiers, infinite quantifiers, and so on. But that doesn't mean that English has any truth functional connectors or quantifiers. I think this is a confusion between a speech and a part of speech. I can always explain to you, that I'm using and truth functionally. But people, if they're given the thing, if they're given anything they can produce automatically, rather than in communication, the difference between a speech and a part of speech is important to me. Part of speech is public language, it's automatic, you're on automatic pilot. A speech is addressed to the person you're talking to. And I can say, look here, I mean truth functional and when I say and. Not the old, I ate hot dogs and got gas at Bill's store and so on joke. No, you say, I mean ordinary truth, I mean the material, truth functional and. And you can do that because you're talking to the person. But if you fit, for example, a handicapped person with a device for printing out a few sentences and then conjunctions and so on of them, and you explain on the panel, this is truth functional connectives, if he starts using them causally, that's just too bad for you. You can't do anything about this. Kripke sometimes thinks that he can stipulate in a language, that the users have to proceed in certain ways. What happens if you don't? Well, you're kicked out of the language. But the point is that you cannot control what people are going to be able to get across. You give them the language, and what they are able to get across is something that you can't control. And this is based on, they use the language in connection with what they see, what they become present to. And what impressed Plato most, perhaps, was Menaechmus' discovery of the conic sections. The conic sections, it's not a matter of verbiage at all. You can see all of them. You can see them all. And pointing them out, perhaps by using language or just drawings, you become mutually present. It's present to you. I mean, I think this is important in religion too. But the thing is, you find that something is present to you. This is not dependent on language. You use language to help you with this, but its presence is something that is between you as a dialectical group. That's why philosophy is dialogue. It's not something that goes into the general language. So that while people wonder about color terms, there's a lot of discussion of color terms, as opposed to mathematical terms. The striking thing is that many people can understand the conic sections and talk about them with general terms freely, and it can go out into the general language. Now you take color terms, you put 10 patches of red, or forget red, just put 10 patches of color on the board. And if you're dyers or painters, you will know them very, very well. You will have no trouble distinguishing them. The words won't matter. You will really know them. But it's a fact about people that if you give names for them and turn it out in the general population, this will collapse because people their memory can't hold those things well. Memory can hold the conic sections. They can't hold colors. That's why colors are so amorphous, and people talk about color words not expressing properties. They don't express properties because of the general usage, the fact that they've gotten away from the things that were present. At any rate, let's see here. There were some cases I wanted to cover. I wanted to really attack the idea that we could have recursive forms for knowing what a sentence says. I think that's at the basis of Tarski's theory of truth. And the idea, some people will belittle the idea that we can really know what is said. And they'll say this is impossible, it's a will-o'-the-wisp. And since we can never know the proposition, then we should just settle for sentences. I've seen people saying this these days. I think this is a lot like philosophical skepticism, where we just agree that knowing is impossible, and then we settle for true belief. where true belief is explained in some other terms. I think that's very bad morale. In litigation, sentences may be the focus. The defendant in a contract case may not be concerned with getting across what he said, but rather with wriggling out of the charge that he said it. The agent gets tied to his words and is identified by them. In this atmosphere, computational logic is a great guide. It's a great aid to casuistry. And that is a valuable activity, an important one. But it's not dialogue. So, I'm skipping some things, but I wanted to touch on others. One point about Tarski's formula, you know, snow is white if and only if snow is white. That presumes that there's just nothing to knowing what snow is white is saying and not paying attention to the different things it can say. And, you know, it's a trivial exercise now to Google. I just typed in fact, I start typing and it finishes the sentence for you, you know, is freshly fallen snow, you know, and then white. And then you quickly go on to, you know, all sorts of odd-colored snow, just, you know. So you realize, looking at snow color theory, that snow is white is really quite, you know, that's quite a complicated issue to get at. The man writing Stanford Encyclopedia entry, very clever, uses snow is slight. And I think that's a clever way of saying he doesn't care a straw about this. I mean, you know, he wants to get on to the formal logic. I think that's very good, but why not just use S? I just want to say, you know, I'd make the same thing about snow is slight, really. But he wanted to just dismiss this. He doesn't want these kind of tiresome people, you know, worrying about what you're saying. Well, I think I'm going to, well, there's a couple of other cases before I stop. So one, you get a question like this. There's the inference I call if to horseshoe. If P then Q, therefore P materially implies Q. The question is whether this is a valid form. Now, you may know my attitude here because I think if P then Q is not a logical form. P materially implies Q is because it's naming an eternal relation, you know, between truth functional things in terms of truth functional actions. But anyway, supposing we take a standard case, Percy attended. If Percy attended, then Quincy attended. I mean, this is like snow is white. This is really trifling. Percy attended, Quincy attended. And then I say, just consider a case. So Percy is a hero, very tough veteran, and not a man that's easily managed and controlled. And his boss says, Percy, it's really important you're going to this function. And Percy says, no thanks. And he says, listen to me, Percy, this is an order. You are attending. I said, all right, okay. And he knows Percy's a tough case. But Percy better show up. This is really important. So Percy drives up in his sports car, parks it, you know, at the steps, walks up the steps. He's met by the butler, and the butler says, sir, just give me your keys, and I'll have it taken around to the back. We're not allowed to park there, sir. And Percy says, that's okay, I can handle it. He goes back, gets in his car, and drives off. Now, the question is it true that Percy attended? This could be a big issue. Percy's in a bit of trouble. And he has his loyal followers, but now it's been a long time since he was in the war. And you can only get so far on your, you know, your reputation. But anyway, you get into an argument about whether Percy attended. And I say, it's hard to know. It may be even impossible to know what you're talking about. It's not that there's nothing here, because if Percy didn't attend, he's in trouble. So you have this, did Percy attend? It's not that it just throw out the question. It's nonsense. Because if the predicate didn't attend applies to Percy, he may go through all sorts of trouble. And his good friends think he attended. But this thing, is it true or false? I say, here's the, you say, is this true or false? You're worrying about the proposition. I say, what thing? I mean, you don't know what you're talking about. If somebody's saying, is it true or false that Percy attended? I would say, you haven't got anything yet. I mean, you've got the sentence, but what good is that going to do you? And you can ask about whether it's true that P is equivalent to P and so on and so forth, but people ignore the fact that they may not have ever gotten hold of anything in the first place. And again, Percy may have an old buddy Quincy, very similar. They might have been in the same outfit, both tough as nails. And Quincy is also ordered to go. And Quincy shows up in a similar sports car, goes up to the same Folsom butler, and gets annoyed and drives off in a similar huff. And somebody says, if Percy attended, Quincy attended. And what's he mean? I mean, he means justice requires. You couldn't possibly fairly hammer Percy for non-attendance without doing the same to Quincy. You got to treat the like cases alike. It doesn't mean that you have any conception of what it would be for Percy to have attended. I mean, you don't know that. But you do have these social consequences tied to it. I gave another example, which is somewhat lamer, but we have Andy, and he's in a large group with a hidden placard reading, "Snow is white." He just happens to have it with him. He simultaneously gets urgent text messages from 6 friends, all mutually unacquainted with each other, asking 6 different important questions. Ben wants to know the color of cocaine, Chuck the race of his upcoming date, Snow, and so on, if you see what I mean. Anyway, it turns out that he can handle all this at once by holding this up and waving it, you see. And in fact, he succeeds in dealing with the information problems of all of his friends. And we might say, in other words, we could locate 6 different propositions connected with this sentence, but that would be something that, could be a separate kind of problem. Now, I had a last page here. How am I doing for time? I've lost track of it. I think 2 minutes. Well, I'll just read this last page. Because we have these sentences. Socrates is mortal. Being mortal is a property of Socrates. Socrates and the property of being mortal in that order stand in the relation of instance to property. The property of being mortal and Socrates in that order stand in the relation of property to instance. Now, I say those are all ways of saying the same thing, at least in my group. Nominalists will complain that logic should be ontologically neutral. Here's Gilbert Harman. A theory of logical form should avoid describing unnecessary ontological commitment. Well, these invocations of properties and relations are outrageous if they're palmed off as merely more or less explicit ways of presenting the same thing. Now, I think this is a fair complaint. I think the nominalists have a point. But it's very hard to evaluate. I mean, maybe impossible. If they're mistaken, they can't even properly identify what we're disagreeing about. We can't even agree about what we're disagreeing about. They may not acknowledge ontological commitment to ontological commitment. Is logic in charge of this chaos? Consider John Henry hit the drill bit. This is an old exchange I used to have with Davidson. John Henry hit the drill bit, and he did it repeatedly. What did he do repeatedly? Well, not an act of hitting, the act of hitting. Oh, no, the act of hitting, no, that's too Platonic. No. The ontological economy people say no. He did one act, then another, then another. We sort of lose track just how many. So the economizers see John Henry repeatedly perform the act of hitting on the drill bit as a bad inference from A, John Henry hit the drill bit and did it repeatedly. I mean, they don't want that. That would be bad because you'd get the act of hitting. You don't want that. We don't want to admit that kind of thing. So they're very concerned about not inferring that. I don't think logic, incidentally, is going to be the judge here. Others of us see these as 2 ways of saying the same thing. Economy is one source of wanting to see logical properties as features of sentences correctly determined only with reference to the regulated styles of speaking. Platonists need to respect such motivation, even if it makes communication extremely difficult. We can understand Jack Frost has been at work, or Neptune is angry, as saying truly there is frost or the ocean is turbulent, without any commitment to Jack or Neptune. I mean, even I, a heavily committed type, don't believe in Jack or Neptune. We can assert the sun rises in the east without implying ignorance of astronomy, and the solution to the general quintic, though once widely expected, is demonstrably unattainable without implying incoherence or Meiningianism. it would be good to engage in dialogue with intelligent people who believe in Jack, Neptune, or the rotation of the sun around the Earth. I think this would be, and I think that we could come to terms, we'd understand what we were saying. But with nominalists, no, probably not. Okay, that's my closing thought. Thank you.
You seem, as a Platonist, you seem to emphasize the importance of dialogue, and you talk a lot about Socrates. But I'm no Plato expert, but I remember Plato seeming to distinguish through Socrates' mouth between different kinds of writing, and there'd be certain kinds of writing that just sat there and didn't change themselves, and you couldn't ask them things. Then there's other special kinds of writing that Socrates thinks might exist, hopefully, that can sort of change and engage in some kind of dialogue. So then my question to Plato, who was writing this, pretending as though he didn't know that these kinds of writings existed, but really implying that his writings were those writings. Can we use some kind of formal analysis of language to distinguish between the kinds of writings that are effective at engaging in dialogue and the kinds of writings that are not? Because it seems at least implicit in Plato is the ability to make that kind of distinction. That there are that we can actually talk about different kinds of writing. There are some that are good and effective, and there are others that just sit there like lumps.
Well, there certainly are both kinds, and we agree. And I would say just that this is an evaluative comment about the kind of language, and some language, like Plato's dialogues, where he's going back and forth, say you could say this, you could say this, you're confronting the fact that when in the original case we were recognizing properties together when we were tribal people going about. But then we got general terms and they got loose, and they could be used by liars, deceivers, and extended beyond, so they may be extended to new cases that we don't know about, we haven't been there. So it's just a chaotic situation. But it is true that we have a lot of associations with our words. Now, a great writer can take advantage of some associations, and he knows he'll pick up a few here and a few there, and he begins to combine them. And the poets do this really wonderfully. And then they manage to bring us to see something, which is really wonderful. They make things present to us because they recognize that the words themselves are not well connected, but once you triangulate, you bring them together, you can do great things. And then you can have great writing, yes.
But it seems like that has nothing to do with dialogue, right? Because the reader is not there. Plato doesn't say there's certain kinds of writing which, when paired with the right reader, it's almost as though it's right there in the words, and that there's some kinds of words that just do this because of the way they've been put together. And there are other kinds of words that don't. Does that make sense? So there's no dialogue at all. It's just that there's a certain kind of language that's superior because of how it's been put together.
Yeah.
Plato seems to be saying, as far as I can tell.
I don't think he is, but at any rate, I mentioned the case of oracles and the like, where you get this take it or leave it. And I say that those can be distracting. They're worth looking at, but there has to be the sense of the possibility of interrogation and bracketing and going back and forth. And that's what you have with Plato. I mean, you always have the sense that if you had been able to talk to him, you want to talk to him very much, then you'd have been able to really clear up things. I mean, there'll be a lot of things that can't be cleared up. You can't understand, and he's letting you know that that's true. There's no way that you're going to get this straight, just as I feel that it's very unlikely that you and I will get this straight right now because dialogue takes time. I mean, dialogue takes more time than modern people have. And everybody now, I was talking to a dean who gets 600 emails a day. And I thought, well, there's a communication for you. But I just can't do that. I don't understand that. And people will have, 1,000 friends on Facebook and so on and so forth. I don't understand that. So it seems to me that you really can have the impression, of course, that some piece of writing will reach very, very many people. And sometimes it may do that in spite of giving different messages. You take something like Descartes' Meditations. Ian Hacking used to point out that this is something that's just been taken up by everybody all over the world, and it's because they may not agree exactly what it's saying, but it just somehow grabs you. And I don't deny that that happens. But still, I say ultimately there is the fact that we have the shared presence of some property, which we're perceiving among ourselves. And this is going to be a community of people in dialogue, not something that's simply characteristic of the language.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a point of clarification. I'm not sure I entirely understand the work that a Platonic notion, that the Platonism specifically about meaning or of the underlying form of a sentence structure. So, like for example, if I have two natural language sentences that, so let's say one in English and one in Chinese, and they're simple sentences, just says John walks, for example. There's an underlying similarity between these two sentences. And you're saying that the underlying similarity does not result in some sort of similarity in the logical underlying structure of the
I have no idea about the similarity between John walks and a sentence in Chinese. I mean, I just have no clue. You're telling me there's an underlying similarity.
Okay, so yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get to the heart of. So
I don't know what you mean. I mean, when you say there's an underlying similarity, I just don't understand at all.
Okay, so well, to take a truth conditional perspective, right? If I say the truth conditions for the sentence in Chinese, whatever it may be, and John runs or John walks, whatever I said, are the same.
So the truth conditions are the same. That is, he has to walk, right?
Yeah.
And then we have the truth conditions for Percy attended, too.
Right.
I mean, he has to have attended.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have a very good grip on them. That was one of my concerns. I don't think that that's something that we just have. I mean, there is maybe various meanings of attended or walking. And we may know what we mean because we apprehend this.
But is that a vagueness issue, or is that a...
Well, there's vagueness
Right.
as an issue. Is that a vagueness
Well,
issue?
is it an ambiguity in language, or is it a vagueness issue in the thing itself?
Can't we just give another example to get past these vagueness difficulties and say John stuck a silver knife 4 inches into the center of a cake or something like that?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Attendant is vague.
Right.
Walks can have vagueness
Right.
to this drawing. Something very, very precise. You could say that in English and Chinese or English and German.
So you're saying that the word attended is vague.
It seemed to me that that's what you were saying. It seemed that
I
source
see.
of the
I didn't mean to be
difficulty was that
saying
there
that.
was
I didn't mean to be saying that. But so you'd be saying about the word attended that it has the property of being vague, and then you would explain what that means. I don't want to be cagey here. I have a colleague who's always giving a seminar on vagueness, and he's always keeping up on the vagueness writing and all. And I have the impression that vagueness has gotten, I don't want to say vague, but I mean, in other words, it's really, in other words, it's associated with a lot of different thoughts, just a lot of different thoughts.
I didn't mean to hijack your
Yeah.
question. I was just trying to
But,
suggest
but
an example that might.
you know, I mean, behind the vagueness problem, the Sorites paradox and so on,
Right. Yeah.
there is mathematical induction, which we have to respect. And this has, it's really fundamental. If somebody grasps the natural numbers, he grasps that they're well ordered. You don't even have to take up anything about negation. And if you have a genuine property of numbers, it determines a set of numbers, and it has a least element. And then you can do this with the seconds in a person's life. You can't speak English when you're a second old, and you can't speak English and so on. But what seems to me overwhelmingly clear here is that the mathematics is self-evident, so the answer must be that we don't really understand a property. I mean, that we don't know what we're talking about when we say, understands English. And people won't mean the same thing. They won't have the same sense. And I say the Sorites then is a confusion about induction and failing to see that it only holds for properties. And those are things we have to grasp. And it doesn't have to be, I've had math students say mathematical induction only works in math. And I say, well, that's too bad. Then you're giving up on counting. I mean, that's very bad for applied math. No, that's not it at all. But it only works with respect to properties. And people, see, one thing I'm preaching here is that the nominalists have led us to think that there's nothing to a property, it's just a shadow of a word. And I think this is a swindle. I think that's wrong. We have to think about seeing the properties.
So to use our other example of translated sentences in the first place, right? You think that it's a fundamentally different case where I have two, we can make it specific, or we can use something like attended or walking or whatnot, or we can use something specific like dug a knife at 4 inches in the center table. It doesn't matter. You're saying there's a relevant difference between these two expressions being experienced by merely competent speakers of the languages and by having that event take place right in front of two people who are competent speakers of these two languages and having them express that in those two different languages. Does that make sense?
It does make a certain sense, but you're thinking, in other words, what it seems to me you're thinking about is perfect clarity, perfect understanding. And you're taking, being there with the knife being placed and so on is the case.
Right.
But of course you may not get that. I mean, misunderstanding and difficulty is something that's always with us. It's the human condition. But we shouldn't forget that also perfect understanding is available, and we can achieve that. But now if you want just to assign some verbal thing for when this happens, I don't think you can do it. It's just like Quine on ontological commitment. I mean, when are you ontologically committed? If a mathematician says, there are some results that are demonstrably unattainable, such as solutions are unquintic, he's innocent. He's not to be picked on by philosophers. The philosopher is the one who says, I wonder where it's located, and so on, it's beyond being, and so on. In other words, he's a bad guy. And the innocent mathematician is just talking. So when do you say somebody really is in trouble, he's doing ontology or not? And Quine comes along and says, well, you use the existential quantifier. That does it. And I think that's ridiculous. And that's just ridiculous. But there is still something. I mean, you can do, if you're talking among yourselves, you can spot when somebody's got ontology problems. But this is not something that can be tied permanently to some verbal signal.
Okay.
Yeah.
But many things can't be explained in any language in a reasonable number of words, right?
Yeah.
That we can all agree that's
Yeah.
what it is, right? Even this question with attending, right? Even
Yes.
if I made a definition, right?
Oh, well, yeah.
You could still dissect,
yeah,
it
the
unless I give you enough words.
You're
that
using
you
words,
can't
yeah, and the words,
dissect it.
yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so the question of attending or not attending, no matter how long our definition is or how many words we've used in that definition, we would still argue whether or not Percy and Quincy.
We might still argue if we're not communicating well. I mean, I don't want to be sounding like a pessimist. If it weren't possible to communicate at all using words to people you didn't even know, then I'm wasting my breath and so on. I agree with that. But there's always this possibility. It is like philosophical skepticism. I mean, it's always possible somebody thinks some obvious knowledge case, and you give an example where those specifications are met and the person doesn't know. And one thing that'll happen is people will get nasty and say nobody knows anything, which I think is really unhealthy, or they'll be dissatisfied if you don't have some general way of telling. But the fact is we manage to know quite a lot. And we can manage without foundationalist formulas that can give us a test. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think Church said something like it'd be a good thing to teach young kids to speak predicate logic. Didn't Church say something like it would be a good thing to teach kids to speak predicate logic as a natural,
Yeah.
obviously you think that's
I do think that's,
nutty.
I do,
Can you
yes.
say a little bit? I mean, and I thought he was a Platonist too,
That's true.
so I wonder where the
Right.
gap between.
Yeah, that's right. And they say Frege was a Platonist too. And I say, no. But anyway, but look, I could just go back to my case for the person, the handicapped person who's using truth functional connectives. You can use these connectives to mean and as a result and so on. You can use these connectives a great variety of ways. And what determines whether you're doing this, your success. And I could have spoken about the individuation of languages, but mathematical logical languages are definable. I mean, they could be defined very precisely. They could be reduced to Gödel numbering, You could just describe them in terms of numbers or in terms of geometry, just, formulas for the writing out the stuff. But natural language is not like that, because with natural language, it's what we use to share what we encounter. And what we encounter depends on where we are. And people can encounter very different things. And people can get in the habit of not encountering anything. Like I say, I'm on the side sort of a religious fanatic. But the point is, I realize, that people are very unsympathetic to this attitude. But people can feel that they are encountering something. And other people may, just go along without ever being interested in that sort of thing. And I say, the same thing applies in music, mathematics, wherever. I mean, there are people who are into something, who are seeing things, experiencing things, and they're using language as a tool to communicate about them. And you don't want to get into word worship or idolatry, because you have to recognize that the words are just a tool and you have to be present to the thing, and that's different. You can't assign the words permanently by definition. You can't define words. You can't define words. Yeah.
What other route to abstract objects are there? You can't come across those.
Abstract objects?
Yeah, Platonic objects.
Abstract objects, that was me stamping my foot. But look, Aristotle was a conceptualist. He held the view that universals are achieved by acts of abstraction. Abstraction. That's anti-Platonism. I see people defining Platonism as the view they're abstract objects. I think this is really bad, because for Plato, universals are not in the mind. I mean, they're definitely not in the mind. They're not mental constructions. They're not created by us. And they're things that we can see. I like the conic sections as an exercise because you can go through them. I didn't do that, but it's quite wonderful. And when you see the conic sections and you see them, then you can introduce definitions. You can define, once you have this thing before you itself. If you just started with words, you wouldn't get it. But you see a parabola in terms of a plane intersecting the right circular cone, parallel to a generator line not containing it, and so on. You see that. Then you can define the parabola as a locus of points, sum of whose distance from a fixed line, fixed point is a constant. Then you can do that because you've managed to get the words in touch with the things. But if you just started with the words, anytime you start with the words, it could go some other way. It depends on the focus of the people. And that can't be maintained through too much extension and generalization, spread of language. But abstract objects, you're saying, how can you encounter abstract objects? Is a parabola an abstract object?
Yes.
Well, and do you have trouble doing that?
Encountering one?
Yes.
Directly. It's always mediated through tokens of parabolas.
Well, I think when you're thinking about them. And you're thinking about them in your mind, and you can talk with each other. We haven't done this exercise enough, but we talk with each other, and we all have them in mind, and we're talking there, we're looking at them, and we're talking about them. And that's as direct, I don't know, direct and indirect are pretty loose terms, but anyway, that seems to me direct enough. And whether it's abstract, I don't know. I mean, abstract, as I say, to me, comes from conceptualism or caricatures and the like. You know what abstracting is you skip a lot of the details and you take some linear forms and the like. Anyway, I don't think of universals as abstract entities at all. And you're telling me how it is that we manage to encounter abstract entities. I say I encounter all sorts of ideas. And I don't worry too much about how I manage to do this, but I'm quite sure that I do, and we share them. People share them. But anyway.
We should go ahead and wrap this up. There's lunch in the other room. We will reconvene at 12:55 in here.